welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. I really hope that you had a wonderful Christmas and welcome to 2026. So my first guest for the new year is Brad Todd. Brad's a commentator on CNN and one of the founding partners of On Message Inc., a political consulting firm. In this podcast, we're going to talk about the role of grace and actually the lack of it in public life, and how we can find it in a time when there is so much political polarization. A little bit about Brad. He hails from East Tennessee. He grew up Southern Baptist, but now attends a United Methodist church in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., which is actually pastored by a former guest of the podcast. Being that Brad is engaged in political campaigns, we are going to talk about where grace, faith, and politics intersect. And this is an election year, so these are all important topics to talk about. Brad is the co-author of The Great Revolt, which was a Washington Post best-selling book about the current realignment underway in American politics. His opinion columns have appeared in Politico, CNN.com, Roll Call, and FoxNews.com. And he lives in Alexandria, Virginia, with his wife, 2 kids, and as he describes, some ferocious Boston Terriers. So, here is my conversation with Brad Todd. All right, Brad, I wanted to start by getting to know a little bit about you and kind of your background, where you come from, and your kind of religious history as well.
Sure. Dennis, thanks for having me. Appreciate the chance to be on the show. And I appreciate our interplay over the last several months on Substack. You know, that's my midlife crisis, my Substack account. And what for? I put a plug in for it. If anybody wants to read it, check it out. It's a commentary about a wide range of cultural things and political things. My religious background, I grew up Southern Baptist in East Tennessee. My family was very involved in the church. The church was our social life in many ways. My mom came from a very large family that had been on this same piece of land since the 1840s. The family, about 2/3 of the family had split off in 1960 and formed their own church with another family or two, as is common in rural communities. And so my mom was the charter member of that church, and she was the organist, and she was very engaged. When she married my dad, my dad also came from a very religious family. His father's kind of a missional lay music leader. He would go up in the mountains and find a church that didn't have a music leader and lead the singing until they could find somebody. When he was a young man, he and his brother were church planters in the Cumberland Mountains. One of them preached, one of them did Sunday school, one of them led the singing. So Dad fit right in my mom's family's church, and Dad became chairman of the deacons a couple of times, and was very in a leadership role the whole time. So my sister and I grew up in leadership roles in the church. I'm a writer by training and by profession, and my first writing gig was the church newsletter. I had been dormant for a few years, and I took it over and started up when I was probably in junior high, middle school. So, just grew up in the church, and, we're United Methodist now. My wife grew up in the United Methodist Church. I had already joined the United Methodist Church before we met and left the Baptist Church. And so, it's a ever-present part of our lives. I did a double major in college, and religious studies was my double for fun. I didn't expect to use it or anything, but just for fun.
Well, one of the reasons I want you on the podcast is because we know someone in common. That's Jason Micheli, who is your pastor of Annandale United Methodist in suburban DC. And you were kind of saying as we were preparing for the podcast that DC is a place that basically the business, it's a factory town, basically. And having growing up as I did in Michigan, where I was, everyone worked for GM. In Washington, everyone pretty much works for the government in some way. Um, and the thing that's been interesting is how much in churches things sometimes have become so kind of polarized in many ways. And what's been interesting in seeing, and I'm fascinated, is still seeing some churches where are places where there still is diversity, and not just diversity in the way that we like to think of it, which is still important, where it's of African Americans and whites and of all kind of the ethnic diversity, but also political diversity. And I think that that's even very much important these days. And I'm just kind of curious of how do you see that showing up in your church, and how is that happening, and how is it, and why is that, how do you see that still necessary in our day and age?
Well, our church is diverse. I'm sure if you took a look at everybody's on the voter file, it would lean left, as most mainline
Hmm.
suburban churches do, mainline denomination churches. But we absolutely have a lot of political diversity in Washington. You can't have a church in Washington without political people. In fact, everyone's political in some way. A lot of military, current military, and ex-military, and people who've worked in the administrative state, in the bureaucracy, and people who work on the outside as consultants or lobbyists or contractors. So it's or lawyers who deal with government cases. If you ask someone in D.C., are they a lawyer? The chances are what they mean is they are a lawyer who sues the government or defends the government. And so or petitions the government. It's even that practice is about it. And if you're a dentist or a chiropractor, all your patients are involved in government, right? So it's inescapable connections to it. I do think that church ought to be the place where melding people of different political ideologies is the easiest, because the premise of being in church is that we're all equally sinful, we're all equally incapable of pulling ourselves out of that sin, and that we are all equally entitled to the grace that comes from Jesus, and no one gets any more or less of it. And by merely walking through the door, we're accepting that we all agree on that. So it ought to be the place where political differences get erased immediately, simply because we all, by showing up, accept that premise that we're all in the same boat.
Hmm. Why do you think that that's not the case in so many places these days?
Well, religion is a great generator and enforcer of moral codes, and it's throughout all of human history. People who were not religious at all have embraced religion as a means to help organize society and sort of compel order.
Hmm.
And so I think that, therefore, it's only natural that people who are practicing in religion would conclude some kind of moral code emanates from their view of religion, and that puts up an immediate obstacle for, oh well, if you don't arrive at the same conclusions I do about that moral code, then perhaps you're not as sanctimonious or holy as I am. And so I think that's probably a natural outcropping, because religion is such a handy generator of moral codes. Um, but I think you just have to strip it down. Like and you have to strip it all the way down and get it back to what it exactly is. I have some secular liberal friends who I debate and argue with sometimes, and they love to mock. Oh, well, so that's not very Christian of these right wing people, but they don't understand what Christianity is. I was like, well, Christianity is not about your politics. It is about whether you agree that you're in intractable sin and need the saving grace of Jesus, and that you need to tell that good news to other people. I said that's what Christianity is. And the remark I get is, "Oh, that's not what Christianity really is. It's really just a bunch of moral codes and rules." And the fact that we let other people think that is on us. That's a mistake on the church's part. If we let outsiders not see that really what we're about is grace. And so, Washington, I think it's perhaps a little easier to not have church become political, but because we're surrounded by politics and everything else we do, and so church church is going to do a bad job of being our political organization. There are better political organizations, more efficient ones out there, and maybe in Washington, it's possible that we all know that those exist and are part of them in other phases of our life, and so we didn't have to be our churches. Our church didn't have to be a political organ. Maybe that's part of it. I don't know.
You said this a few times, and I think, and it's something I would agree with is the role of the fact of it being about sinners in the need of grace. What is the role and how important is it about the fact of grace is in the role of your faith and what is that in the role of our public life? And how is that, what is the lack of that being, what does that mean in our public life today? Because I think
Well,
there is something about that.
I'm really worried about rising secularization in both parties
Hmm.
in politics because it takes the commonality of a belief in grace away. Um, and so I think when you decide that not everyone is in need of and entitled to and able to get grace, it leads you to believe that it's okay to wish bad things on the other side, and hope people die. One troubling thing but to me in our civic life today is, every time someone of plenty political note dies, the people on the other side stomp on their grave. Dick Cheney passed away recently, and if you went online, the venom from people in the political left while his family is grieving his death, I just find that completely tasteless and terrible. And it's and this is not a malady that exists only on the left. I'm not saying that at all. But the fact that we've got to a place where we can't let people mourn and we can't acknowledge that passing is a thing to note and stand down for, and sort of put our political swords in their sheaths. That's a real bother to me, and I think it is indicative of a larger malady, and it is the fact that we all don't agree that everybody is in equal need of and is equally entitled to, and it is grace. I think that's what's infecting us, and I think you can trace it back to rising secularism in both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's also a sense of self-righteousness that we feel that we're on the, well, to use a really worn phrase, the right side of history, that we are the ones that are correct. And if I'm right, and if I see the downfall of my enemy, well, then that's something to celebrate. And, that's great. And why should I cry about, someone who dies?
They're both very Old Testament, and
Exactly.
I think you see on the right, you see a lot of a martyrdom, sort of we're righteous and we'll be martyred, we're way outnumbered, as a common sort of rubric of looking at things. And I think on the left, as you point out, there's a lot of history's on our side. The arc of progress is bending toward exactly where we are. The term progressive itself means I am just more enlightened and more advanced, and everything else will catch up to me eventually. That's the root of the term. And so, but those two maladies are the same malady, right there. It is a self righteousness, as you point out, and I think that reconciliation becomes difficult when you decide that, and it is an Old Testament view of things, right? It's my enemies are vanquished, and so therefore I must be blessed. And the new covenant that Jesus brought us is not that at all. And we don't live in that world where our enemies' deaths mean that we are righteous and that we are blessed. Is not We're not being sent signals from God based on our success. And so I do think that is a part of the decline of a common understanding of the New Testament theology.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't see I mean, to really to think about it, our common humanity or even our common sense that someone else is a child of God, um, in the way that I really think about some of the writings of Martin Luther King, that he would see even someone that who was the most racist person still was a child of God. And I don't think we see that anymore, even on the left or on the right, that someone, no matter who they are, is still someone of value. I think we just see them as incredibly evil. Um, and there are lots of reasons why that is, but I think we just don't see that.
We have seen a few instances of it in our current culture, and when we see them, they're startling. When the it's after the Mother Emanuel church killings in Charleston. You remember the families of those victims said that they forgave this young man who came in there. And at Charlie Kirk's memorial service, Erica Kirk stood up and said, "I forgive the man who did this." So when I think that we have a few shining examples of it, and we probably ought to lift those up more. And it might, and we ought to probably all echo them, and it's more forgiveness in our discourse might help us get to reconciliation. Someone asked me yesterday in an interview, how do we bring about more reconciliation in politics? Well, I don't know that you structurally can. I think individually you can. You can lift up forgiveness. You can reach out to people and not question everyone's motive and assume everybody's motive is bad. You can disagree with their program and the steps they take to exact their motive. But I think presuming bad motive is part of our problem too.
I think that also it's part of it is, how do we learn to not fear the other? Um, and this is something that actually also Jason is related with. Was part of something called the Iowa Preachers Project, and it was a group of 10 pastors from across the country, and it was people from a wide spectrum. So from people who were theologically liberal to theologically conservative. And so you had someone like myself and one other persons who were gay, to someone who were people from like the, Wisconsin Synod Lutherans who were pretty conservative. And
Right.
we all were able to get together and to be together and to pray and care for one another, and really actually be friends. And the thing is that none of us was trying to change each other or to try to best one another. It was really to just have a common meeting place. And I think for us, at least as Christians, were to understand that we were all sinners in need of grace. That was the common ground. Um, and I think once that was the common ground, or at least to know that we weren't trying to change each other or trying to best one another, there wasn't any sense of you're my enemy or you're dangerous or something. There was just a sense you're a friend, and we don't agree, and we probably will never agree, but that's okay. That's fine. And I kind of wonder if, is there a possibility that there are ways that we can get to that as a culture? Because I think there seems to always be this sense that we have to have this battle and win. And that's not, I don't think that we can, to me, that seems like that's not a path to anything except loss for everyone.
Well, the one problem with it is it ensures half the people are miserable at all the time.
Exactly.
We're in a zero sum game. I think part of what democracy means is being willing to lose and
Hmm.
recalibrate when you lose and decide how do we change some things after we lose so that we don't lose next time. And we have lost that a little bit as the parties have become purer, and as social media has sort of allowed, and the internet has allowed us to silo ourselves with only people who agree with us. It's 50 years ago, there were liberals and conservatives in both parties. And That doesn't exist now. And there's a political scientist named Morris Fiorina who talks about how inter-party sorting is actually the driver of polarization. The fact that there's not a broad ideological difference inside the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is the reason that the two parties are so hostile and separated. When there was overlap, it was much easier to find common ground because there was a quarter of each party that agreed with the other a quarter of the other party at all times. And so and there were disagreements within each party. And we don't have a lot of inter-party disagreements anymore, near at least on the scale of what we've had previously. And I think that translates into the rest of our lives. And there's a lot of self-storing that happens on the internet. That's what it exists for, right? The algorithms push you toward people who agree with, the freakiest thing you think. The most niche idea you have, the algorithm will get you there because it knows you have a yearning for that and you don't find it in other places. And if it provides it, then you're likely to stay on the app and look at some more ads. And we do that in our own physical lives too. It's gerrymandering has been a hot topic this fall in redistricting. Well, the thing is, it's pretty easy because people tend to move to places where they settle in places where everyone agrees with them, and then social pressure, if they don't agree with them, when everything social pressure pulls them to it, into a lockstep agreement on other things that they didn't have strong opinions on before. So we're fighting a lot of technology and human nature here now, and we're now in structures where societal structures are breaking down, and there are fewer of them, and therefore they become pure. You probably couldn't come to a meeting of the Virginia Annual Conference of Methodists and find a lot of ideological disagreement, and that's not good for the Virginia Conference.
Mm-mm. No. And the thing is also that's kind of related to this is I don't know if you're familiar with the sociologist Ryan Berge. He does a lot of things on religion, and you talk about the Virginia Annual Conference for the United Methodists, and I think a lot of pastors, a lot of religious leaders, especially in the main line, might think that the people in their pews probably all vote the same way. But he's done a lot of research, and especially in the 2024 election, in a lot of the mainline denominations, the vote totals came pretty almost even, maybe just leaning slightly more towards Donald Trump. And so you have people in the pews that are a lot more purple than what
Clergy.
people want to think, than the clergy. And
Yes.
so you have this disconnect. And so how do you kind of deal with that? And I don't know if the clergy sometimes are able or wanting to deal with that reality.
There's no question. I've written about this a couple of times. Selena Zito and I did a piece in the spring of 2024 for Real Clear Politics about it. Almost every religious denomination inside Christianity, almost all of them lean right. And if you just survey the members, and even in an election with someone like Trump, who's polarizing, as you point out, Trump won. I mean, I think he might have lost the Episcopals narrowly. But in the United Church of Christ, he lost them narrowly. But for everyone else, it's not really even tremendously close. But if you survey clergy in almost all those denominations, save maybe the Southern Baptist, it would have been decidedly the other way. Why is that? It has nothing to do with religion, and it goes to higher education. If you have a master's or above degree, the chances that you lean left are really high. And if you have a bachelor's or lower degree, the chances that you lean right are pretty good. And if you only have an associate's degree or a technical degree, I almost guarantee you lean right. And so that gap between clergy and parishioner is an educational gap. And however, I think it sometimes gets made manifest through their view of religion, because we do what we know, right? And we filter things through our priorities. And so I think perhaps a lot of mainline clergy are out of touch with the fact that their parishioners are not as liberal as their fellow clergy are, because it's only human nature to filter your expressions through your professional prism.
Well, I wanted to kind of in the time we have do something that was a little related to what we're talking about, and that's to some of the recent texting scandals. And you're kind of familiar with this, it some I guess very intimately, and that is some of the texting scandals on both parties with Jay Jones, who was the now is the Attorney General elect for Virginia, and then also with the Young Republicans texting scandal. And I think in both cases you had some really just kind of horrible things that came out of those texts that just kind of were things that you would not expect to hear from people, want to hear from people. But also it was just interesting how people responded to them. And I'm just curious, kind of, what do you think it kind of says about us as a society, in that we have people in how people respond to the other party, to people who are different from them, in and just kind of what they're saying about each other, and just kind of something about the moral state that's just kind of disturbing.
Yeah, I worked on the Attorney General's race in Virginia. The incumbent
Mm.
Republican Jason Yares was my client. He's a longtime friend before he ever started running for office. And I've taken that loss pretty hard, to be honest with you. I'm not quite over it yet. Jay Jones, who was our opponent, it was revealed that he had sent text messages to another member of the Virginia legislature wishing for the Speaker of the House to get two bullets to the head. And then he said that sometimes it took violence and personal pain in order to make people change their opinions. And then he fantasized about the Speaker's children dying in the arms of their mother, and maybe that will make him change his political opinions. And it wasn't a joke. The recipient asked him to stop. He didn't stop, and then basically said, I hate it when you talk like this. And he doubled down and kept going. Um, and then we learned later that he also said cops might need to die in order to change police practices, and that would be good. So and inexplicably, he's been elected Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer of our state. So um, I've been very dismayed by the reaction to that, and by the fact that more people didn't find it disqualifying. It was a close election, but not near enough. Um, I got a lot of people who pushed back on me and said, "Well, that's just a private text. It's not like that's his public position." Um, I think it's worse that it's his private view, because his private views eventually are going to drive his public actions. And so and then the young Republican fiasco you saw as well, with some of the leaked check exchange, some of them glorifying Hitler and Nazis, I think those were probably leaked by a rival faction of the young Republicans in New York. Also, discounted by, this was a private text chain. I don't know that our private thoughts should be, we should get a pass for that, and that only the things we wash through the prism of what we think is socially acceptable should count. So I get back to, we no longer have this sort of common premise, or it's breaking down at least, that we're all in need of the same amount of grace, and that we're all going to get the same amount of grace, and that once we accept that status and we accept the fact that we're in need of it, I think it's humbling, and perhaps it makes it easier to be on the same plane as other people who disagree with us.
Where do you see hope?
Well, I think we still live in a great country where we have an ability to disagree with each other and not risk getting killed for it, or imprisoned for it. It's the economic consequences for it, and that's unique even among the Western world. Europe, the freedom of speech in Europe is not near what we have here in the United States right now, and I think we have a pretty resilient structure that. To our government that the founders gave us, with a lot of checks and balances that can stop some of the excesses of our zeal. And so I think the fact that we have come through this fairly turbulent time and we are still speaking out. And I think that that's optimistic to me. I think that we are in fact, there are some negative trends in society that seem to be leveling off. For the moment, the dechurching of the country seems to be leveling off. Hope this is not a dead cat pounce. I hope that the leveling off is a as a permanent status. I still see hope in my neighbors. We're getting ready to do a hypothermia overflow shelter at our church, and there's a couple in our church who put so many hours into this every year. We do it twice a year, and it takes 80 volunteers to pull it off every time. And these people literally give, weeks and weeks and weeks of their time so that, people don't have to sleep in the cold for 10 days twice a year, 8 days twice a year. And you see stories like that all over the place still. And those are the things that inspire me and give me hope. You see people starting small businesses with and take their families from one economic level to another. We see that all around us. It starts with a food truck and turns into a strip mall location, turns into something more prosperous than that with 4 or 5 people working for them. So that kind of thing still gives me hope. I still see aspirations in people to do better and be better. And that I guess that those sort of individual uplifts drive me.
Yeah, I think there is something to say about kind of what's happening at a local level that can still inspire some sense of hope.
If you go back all the way back to Alexis de Tocqueville, the French philosopher who visited the United States in our infancy, the thing he found most unique about us was these small associations, these small units of how Americans came together to achieve things in congregations and in civic societies and clubs. That's always been sort of the secret sauce of free countries. And so I think that means we should hearken back to it right now. And, Edmund Burke called them little platoons. In my Substack, I try to write about 1 out of 4. I try to write what I call a little platoon column, right? Something that sort of tell me about the interactions between generations or between some things inside a family unit or teams, things that sort of bind people together and try to make. I don't always get 1 out of 4 columns as a little platoon, but I try to hit that. And I think that's the right place to look for how things can work.
Well, if people want to know more about you, where should they go?
Well, I write on Substack, The What For, and I'm also on CNN as a commentator about 4 times a week. I'm on shows like AC 360 in The Arena, which airs at 4 p.m. Eastern. AC 360 airs at 8 p.m. Eastern. I'm on State of the Union on Sunday mornings before church sometimes. It airs 3 times on Sunday. Sometimes I'm on the Laura Coates Show at 11 p.m. Eastern. So if you're on the West Coast, that's a show you can catch in your time zone. So most of that commentary is political. My Substack column is, only sometimes political. So, but I hope if folks will join, give some feedback. We'll take it in stride and adapt.
Brad, thank you for this. This was a really good talk, and hope to have you back on sometime soon.
Sure, Dennis. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Have a good day. All right.
Usual, what are your thoughts about the episode? Do you think that grace can be found in our modern politics? As usual, feel free to send me an email. I actually love to hear from people, get their opinions on this. And you can do that by going to churchandmain at substack.com. Feel free. I would love to hear from you. Also, a few things just to let you know about. I will put a link to Brad's Substack, which is called The What For. And I'm also putting a link in to the top episodes of 2025. I didn't do an episode kind of rehashing all of that, but I decided to put that in a Substack post. So I hope that you would look at that and find out what those top episodes were. They're quite varied. I think really cool episodes. I enjoyed talking to everyone, but these were some really good episodes that we did in 2025, and these are the top ones that I really want to share with folk. And I'm hoping maybe at some point I'll put out a list of some of the other ones that were interesting, that were good, that I'd like to share as well. But those two links are available. They'll be in the show notes. And also, if you want to learn more about the podcast and listen to past episodes or donate, you can go to churchandmain.org. Churchandmain.substack.com is where you can read related articles, such as the said article I just talked about. I would also hope that you would consider subscribing to the podcast. You can do that by subscribing on your favorite podcast app. And also would hope that you would consider leaving a review or a rating. When you do that, that actually helps others find the podcast. So I really do hope that you can consider doing that. If you don't feel like typing out a long thing about how, the podcast is, just simply leave a rating. Either way, that really helps others find the podcast, which is something I really want to have people do to find this podcast. If you want to make a donation, there is a link in the show description. Also, if you would like to get this episode basically in your email inbox, there's also a link for that as well. So that is it for this episode of Church and Main. It's the first one of 2026. I'm looking forward to a lot of good interviews in this coming year. Obviously, 2025 was a year, especially when it comes to the church and public life, that was not boring. And for obvious reasons, 2026 is not going to be boring either. So be on the lookout for some podcasts on some very important issues. So as I said, this is it for this episode of Church and Main. Thank you so much for listening. That always means a lot to me. Take care, everyone. Godspeed. And I will see you next time.